Hello everyone, it's Carol here at Oak House Journals. Lovely to have you with me as always. So I'm going to do week 15 of the Stitched Circle Show Challenge being hosted by Lisbeth Degn. Details in the description box below the video. What you're looking at here is the piece I completed for week 14. So I'm going to create a piece that picks up the same colour tones, the bluey green colour tones that I did for last week. So the Dogma rules for this week. The first rule is to trace a circle onto watercolour paper and then colour wash it in either blue, green or turquoise. So here you can see I've got out my watercolour paints, and right in the middle there I've done a bit of a colour wash going off the left hand side there on some paper that I'm going to use. And then I lifted out some threads from my stash and actually gave those a bit of a colour wash as well, so that they would work on this piece of watercolour paper. And here's a better look, or a closer look, at those two textured threads that I gave a bit of a colour wash with. This one was originally white, and I will trim that one down a bit more in due course, but you'll see that as the video progresses. And then this one had very pale blue, so it now looks a bluey green. And I also lifted out just some normal DMC threads. One on the left there is a sagey green, and the one on the right is a blue. And I used both those in last week's project for week 14. So moving on from that, as I said, the first Dogma rule for this week was to trace a circle onto watercolour paper that had been colour washed. Now, I used that first sample piece of colour washed paper and created my circle, but I also had that spare piece, the piece on the right hand side that you see here, left over. So what I decided to do is to mount the circle onto that spare piece of colour washed paper rather than directly into my book as Lisbeth did. So a slight variation. I don't think it's breaking the rules, I just think it's just a slight difference in how I mount my finished piece. So here you can see the circle is just laying on top of that spare piece of colour washed paper. And all I do to secure it in place is to add a little bit of glue behind it. And then when I've done my weaving, I will glue the whole thing in place into my journal. So I'm starting a new signature. So here I'm showing you the first page of my new signature opposite week 14. And here I'm just lifting out those threads now that they're nice and dry, just placing them on top, seeing how nice they're going to look. Mentioned that I would be trimming down one of those threads, and this is what I'm doing here. That thread on the left hand side that I'm trimming is really lovely thread, but it had almost like little knobbles of cotton, or little balls of cotton woven into the thread, which were quite big. It would have looked lovely on my piece, but it wouldn't have woven very well between the warp threads that I'm about to put on my circle. So I had to go all along the piece that I'd colour washed and just trim those little cotton nodules down a little bit. So that's exactly what I'm doing here, just using my scissors, pinching the thread, being very careful not to actually snip the thread itself, just the little cotton nodules that were protruding from the twist of the thread. So I'm just speeding up the recording a little bit here so that you're not watching me do this in real time. Didn't take very long, but obviously you don't want to see me doing it all the way down. Just rolling up that piece of thread, just popping it off to one side, ready to use in a minute or two. So here I've got my glued down circle onto that spare piece of watercolour cardstock that has been paint washed. The second of the Dogma rules for this week was to divide that circle into 3 segments and punch holes in the top of each segment, and then another in the centre of the circle where the segments meet. Now, the central hole doesn't actually have to be in the true center of the circle. It just has to be where the three segments are meeting. So here I am just marking out with a pencil where my punched holes are going to be. Here I've got a needle from my needle case, and I just use the needle to punch holes where I've made those pencil marks. So just choosing a fairly thick needle, making a reasonable size hole in the middle, and all my warp threads are going to go through there, and then, as I say, just punching through the cardstock with my needle where I made those pencil marks at the top of each of the three segments. So I'm doing the two there, and this is the third one. I've threaded up a needle with some of the DMC threads. I've got 3 strands, and I'm creating a warp thread using the holes at the top of each segment and the one in the center of the circle. So just going top to bottom, as you can see. Now this was pre-cut thread, so I didn't have much choice as to how much thread I could use. So to secure it before starting a new piece of thread, I just used some sellotape on the back. So you can see the portion that I've been stitching with is still in the needle. And I'm just going to snip that off now. I've put some sellotape on the back to hold it in place. And my new thread is that one going off to the right. As you can see, I'm threading up my needle again, and I'm just going to carry on creating those warp threads in that first segment. So down through the center, and through from the back, and down through the center again. So I do that with the same DMC stranded cotton for all 3 segments. Here I'm just using my bone folder on the reverse to smooth out the holes, and I reinforce all the holes and my warp threads on the reverse with more sellotape. I thought that would give it more stability. And then just a little bit of burnishing with my bone folder on the front. There we go. So the third Dogma rule was to create the warp threads you've just seen me create in each of the 3 segments. The fourth Dogma rule was to weave our threads through the warp threads in each segment to create some weaving. So I start off in each of my 3 segments by using, I think it was 3 strands of the DMC stranded cotton in the pale blue. So very simple, just weaving it up and over through my warp threads as I'm doing here, and then reversing that on the return journey in that segment. Just pushing my threads down, trying to keep it quite tight. Now, when Lisbeth was doing her weaving, she actually made a loop at the sides of each of the segments and continued her weaving, and you can see here that I'm doing exactly the same thing, but I'm using my scissors to create a bigger loop on each side of my segments. So you can see it in more detail here. There you go. I've just made a bigger loop on that right hand side, and I'm going to do exactly the same on the other side. And the reason I've done this is so that I can actually snip my threads. I'm not going to have one continuous piece of thread for my weaving. I want a textured edge, if you will. Just realised I've gone wrong, so I need to correct that. There we go. So trying to keep that larger loop on the right hand side, using my scissors to help me do that, and then doing exactly the same thing on the other side. There we go, popping my scissors in there, because I will be snipping those loops when I finish weaving all the way up to create my fluffy edge or my frayed edge. The thread colour that we could use this week was either blue, green or turquoise, so that was why I chose the sage green that I used last week and the pale blue, and did the colour wash on those textured threads. So I'm just going to speed up the camera now so that you can see me create my weaving, and I will be back to show you what it looks like at the end. So having done the DMC stranded cotton first, I'm going in with one of my lovely textured threads. A little bit of a challenge to thread through or weave through, but nowhere near as difficult as the second one I chose. But it's still managing to pull them through gently, building up my layers, using either my needle or my scissors to push everything down. Liking how that's looking, so I'm stopping there and starting to work on my second segment, and again going in with the DMC stranded cotton first in the pale blue. Didn't really have a plan for how I was going to use my threads, just went with what felt right at the time. And this is what it looks like now I've woven everything, and here I am just going in with my scissors very carefully, trimming those larger loops on either side of my segments to create my frayed edge, and you'll see what that looks like in more detail when you see the close-up photos at the end of the video. And then here I am just putting some glue on the back and gluing it into my signature. So as I say, a few close-up photos for you at the end, everybody, to have a better look. Hope you like this week's assignment or challenge piece for the slow stitched circle show challenge. I never get that right. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope to see you next week for week 16. A big thank you to Lisbeth for hosting this challenge. It really is turning out to be a great deal of fun, and I'm loving it. So here you can just see in the close-up photos the different textures that I've tried to create, and those snipped edges for each of my segments. Until the next video, everybody, take care. Bye bye now.